Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast here. Today, we're going to talk about Najee Harris and Russell Wilson, why I think there actually could be something about that pair this specific season that helps each other in where they are in their careers. That and more of taking your questions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content if you've been making us your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms and conditions apply. All right, everyone, let's get into some questions to finish out the week. It's a Friday. Want to get you guys some thoughts going into the weekend about the Steelers. And we've been piling up more of your questions. And I'm going to answer this first question that we got called in. By the way, if you ever want to call into this show, call in at 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We'll try to get you on the show. This is a question about Najee Harris and his status with the team. And I want to dive into that. But it also led me into thinking about a way I could talk about how I think he can combine with Russell Wilson in a very interesting way. But first, let's take this question so we can dive into it. This is Jovan from Youngstown.
Hey, Chris. Jovan here from Youngstown, Ohio. I want to talk about Najee Harris, man. A lot of these podcasts, not you personally, but a lot of these other podcasts out here are talking about Najee. There's no chance Najee is a Steeler next year. What do you think he's going to sign? I would love to see Najee back. I mean, 3 times he's ran for 1,000 yards. Why does no one want him back? Just seems like no one really wants Najee back, and I just disagree with that. Let me know, man. I love the show. Keep it up, man. Thanks.
Thanks, Jovan. Appreciate the question. Again, 412-223-6644 to get your question on the air like Jovan did. But so, Jovan, let's get into a few things here. There's a want. I feel you on the want part, because I do feel like there has been this animus against Najee Harris since he joined the Steelers from people who wanted him to be a bust before he even took the field. But let's dive into the reality of it. And I do think there are people who are reporting on this that it's not much of a want. It's just of a, hey, it does look like they're not bringing him back here. And I do think that, this argument makes a lot of sense. They didn't pick up his 5th-year option. And I'm one that still advocates they should have picked up his 5th-year option, because $6.7 million, which would have been like the 14th most paid running back in the NFL, would have been a great price for what Najee Harris brings. And you could have had him for 2 more years and then moved on from him afterwards if you wanted to, or signed him to another extension then for not as much money. Either way, the reasoning is when you go back and look at how NFL draft picks, first-round picks have worked for the Steelers, if they're not giving you an extension, they're probably not bringing you back. Like, let's go back to 2009, Ziggy Hood. If you remember Evander Hood, defensive lineman, they drafted 2009 with the last pick of the first round. Didn't work out. No 5th-year extension. Didn't get it. Pouncey, Hayward, DeCastro, all 3 of those guys, yes, kept around. Jarvis Jones, though, not kept around. Ryan Shazier was kept. Bud Dupree was given his 5th-year extension. That, like, he was a weird situation, because when they drafted TJ Watt, they're like, we don't need Bud Dupree anymore. But you look at, like, Artie Burns, didn't get a 5th-year extension, wasn't going to be in that consideration. TJ Watt, yes. Terrell Edmonds, no. They kept him around for a year after that, and then they let him go. And then you go to Devin Bush, obviously didn't give him his 5th-year extension, and he was gone. So you just look at the history of how they've handled guys. If they don't sign you to an extension, to that 5th-year extension, or get you on a long-term contract before your last season, statistically speaking, the Steelers aren't keeping you. But here's the other thing here. I think Najee Harris is in a very unique position, because we've talked about how Omar Khan values what bases a lot of his decisions off of what teams are valuing in the NFL. And he may know, like, hey, there might be a plan to keep Najee Harris long-term. In fact, he said as much that he wants them to be long-term. He wants Najee Harris and the Steelers to be long-term. Granted, he also said he had full faith in Kenny Pickett like a week before they signed Russell Wilson. But I think that there's still there is a chance for Najee Harris to return if the right things go right in 2024. But I think that there's there's a lot that has to happen there. Now, again, on the part where I think people don't like it, there's a lot of people who just really want to bang the drum that running backs are a terrible position and that they don't like running backs, and then running backs should never be the first round pick, and they want to be so proven right that the running back should never be a first round pick and that Najee Harris is a bad pick. And I think that's kind of where people have been coming from on the side of the, he never should have been a good pick. Najee Harris has, again, played on an offense that wasn't coordinated well, hasn't had a really good offensive line until the second half of last season. And that was even just a decent offensive line. That wasn't even a really, really good offensive line like it was in Le'Veon Bell's prime years. And still has found a way to get 1,000 yards each of those seasons, be productive in an offense, and be a key factor in several of the wins that have gotten the Steelers to the playoffs in 2 out of those 3 years, while they've struggled at quarterback in a lot of other places and dealt with massive injuries in several spots. I think Najee Harris is a part of the Steelers' future if they want him to be. Now, there's also the chance that the Steelers are just like, look, we're going to draft a running back in the second or third round this upcoming year because we think we can get a guy that can pair with Jaylen Warren, not have to pay him as much, and we can use that money somewhere else. And if that's the decision, hey, I get it. That's, that's kind of what you can do in today's NFL, is find smart ways to move your money. But I also just remind myself, going back to the 2018 season, one thing that Najee Harris does well is he doesn't fumble the ball. He doesn't put the ball in turf. With all the carries and all the touches that he gets, he protects the football while moving forward. And again, he's done that while getting hit in the backfield consistently throughout his career, because he's played with below average offensive lines to even bad offensive lines at times. But I think back to 2018 when the Steelers lost Le'Veon Bell for the season, and everyone was really excited about James Conner, and I was too. Like, I like the James Conner story is awesome. But the Steelers the running backs fumbled like 7 to 8 times that year, and several of those fumbles came in crucial situations where they lost games because of those fumbles, or those fumbles played a huge role in those in losses. And if they had just won one of those, I think there were like 4 different games that fumbles impacted severely, especially late in the game. If they win one of those games and or just don't fumble one of those times, they make the playoffs in 2018. And who knows what happens, because that offense was still very, very good. And so I always say that was one of the biggest things about missing Le'Veon Bell, was not getting that last chance with the Killer Bees in 2018 to do anything. And I think Najee Harris, he's not a Killer Bee, but he is a guy that I think if you put him in a functioning offense, he could be very productive. And I think that he also compares well to another running back who didn't start off so hot and then developed alongside the quarterback who the Steelers just signed. And of course, I'm talking about the quarterback, Russell Wilson. The running back I'm talking about is Marshawn Lynch. And I've made this comparison before in the show, and I want to make this comparison a little bit deeper in a second here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. We'll do that and take more of your questions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast shortly after this. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, that's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the price that you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay's Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here on the Steelers Taking Your Calls. Now, I want to get back to Joanne's question and kind of pull it out a little bit, because I think that there's, answering the question of why people don't believe in Najee Harris, sticking with the Steelers long term. I think that there's it's just a reality that, they didn't give him the 5th year extension, so it's not likely to happen. But again, I think if something special can happen in 2024, I would find it hard pressed to get rid of a guy who could be a key cog for your offensive system, especially as you're developing a young offense as it is. I mean, let's face it. This is a team with George Pickens, who's still on a rookie contract. Pat Fryermuth's about to end his rookie contract, just like Najee Harris. Guys that are going to be on rookie contracts for years, like Zach Frazier, Troy Fautano, and Broderick Jones. there's a lot of things that you want a veteran presence on this group that can be part of the past and the future and connect that. And I think Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth are two really good players who can be part of that transition that they're doing right now. And again, you don't have to commit to Najee Harris for 8 years, but you can commit to. I think you could commit to him for 3 or 4, beyond this year. And I think that that'll be his prime. And I think that with a good offensive line, or even just a decent offensive line, he can produce better. And again, I want to harken it back to Marshawn Lynch. Go back and look at Marshawn Lynch's early years with the Buffalo Bills, and then transitioning to the Seahawks. He was kind of looked at as a bust by a lot of people. He only ran for 2,600 yards. Najee Harris ran for three in the first 3 seasons, each of their first 3 seasons. Najee Harris ran for about 600 more yards. Granted, he did it on more carries, but their rushing average was right around being the same. He ran for 22 touchdowns to Marshawn Lynch's 17, 866 receiving yards to Marshawn Lynch's 663, 6 receiving touchdowns for Najee Harris to Marshawn Lynch's 1. And again, these aren't complete apples to apples as far as they had the exact same simulated situation where everything worked out. But Marshawn Lynch was a guy who I think always ran hard and always fought hard, but needed to be in a place that could use his skills better. And when he got to Seattle, that's what happened. And it was a system that was working. They had a better offensive line. They had a better quarterback. And that quarterback was Russell Wilson. And I actually think that Najee Harris, I'm not saying he can be beast mode and do all the things that Marshawn Lynch did in his career, but I am saying that I think that he can have a similar uptick in his production. And again, his production hasn't been bad for the Steelers. He's had 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons. He's the only running back in the NFL in the last 3 years to have 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons. And 1,000-yard seasons aren't, crown him as the best running back in the NFL anymore, but it is a sign of consistency, and consistency is very important in the NFL. And again, I look at Russell Wilson and where this ties to him. When he came to the Seahawks and he started playing for them in 2012, that was when Marshawn Lynch was, kind of revitalized in Seattle in 2011 before Russell Wilson started for them. He had 1,200 yards on 285 carries. He with 12 touchdowns. He was kind of established. But when Russell Wilson got there, he took off right away as this efficient quarterback. Again, not in the MVP conversation, but efficient, the very thing that the Steelers are looking for from him now. In fact, in his first 4 years, Russell Wilson, that is, with Marshawn Lynch, so 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015. You look at those seasons, and Russell Wilson had a passer rating of over 103 of those 4 seasons. And the other year he didn't have it over 100. It was 95, so it was very close. And in that last year, 2015, it was 110.1, which was actually the highest in the NFL. Again, speaking to his efficiency and how he performed. Ben Roethlisberger in his entire career had 300, passer ratings of over 100, seasons where he got that. And to me, that is a huge part of what the Steelers need, is just efficiency. And again, this isn't knocking Ben Roethlisberger, but it's saying like getting that is not just something to just turn your nose up at and like whatever. But he was able to thrive, Russell Wilson, that being in an offense that was about running the football, play action was set up, and a team that was based in how good its defense was. Because again, that was the Legion of Boom era, and that was when the Seattle Seahawks were really good about that. And that's exactly what the Steelers are trying to be right now. And I think that that's a big part of what people need to understand about what's going to be asked of Russell Wilson. He's not, and I've said this a million times, he's not going to be asked to do what Ben Roethlisberger did in prime, AB, Killer B, Le'Veon Bell era and try to throw the most in the NFL. They're going to ask him to kind of do what he's done in his best years in the NFL, and that's be efficient with the football. Even last year when he threw 26 touchdowns and 8 interceptions, you give that to the Steelers, they're happy with that. Even his last year in Seattle, 25 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. 2020 is a whole other ball game when he had 40 touchdowns to 13 interceptions. But you give that kind of efficiency to the Steelers in what they've had at quarterback, as long as the offensive line does take a step forward and the running game is moving forward and the defense doesn't get decimated, and even if the defense doesn't take a step up, they're just what they have been, That's a much better team. And again, we're expecting this defense to take a step up because of some of the young guys that are coming up. Patrick Queen's addition. Now, Minka Fitzpatrick's going to play free safety. And we'll get to some of the young guys in the next segment here because I want to talk about that too. But again, I think that Russell Wilson has that potential to be in a system like this. And I also think that Najee Harris has a potential to be in a system like this. And again, Najee Harris, you ask who his mentor was, but one of his biggest mentors was Marshawn Lynch. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to turn in, again, he's not going to turn into beast mode overnight or anything like that. But I do think there is the potential for what Arthur Smith is putting together on offense to be very productive, be very, it could be very, give a boost in the production of both Najee Harris and Russell Wilson to the play styles that could mesh very well. And that's my point here, and kind of building off of Jovan's questions, because I wanted to get into this, but I think the two of them could be truly special together. So to answer your question in the long term, Jovan, I think that people are just reacting to the obviousness of how the Steelers have treated first round picks when they don't give them fifth-year extensions. But I do think that Najee Harris could be a unique case if that special meshing does produce something this year. If it doesn't, they probably will move on. And I think that Najee Harris, it's not his fault why, his numbers haven't been extremely high, but I do think it's to his merit that they've been extremely consistent, even amid an inconsistent offense. So getting to that there, I want to take another question here. This one's a quicker question that we'll get to, but I do think it's a good question because it's not something that everyone knows all the time. But here's David from Wake Forest.
Hey, Chris, this is David from Wake Forest. Actually, I'm usually calling you from Wake Forest, but I'm actually in Latrobe visiting family. Anyway, quick question on the rules of the game with the Cam Sutton suspension. Does he count against the 53-man roster during the first 8 weeks of his suspension? I'm not sure how that works. I don't know if there's a designated list, almost like somebody goes on IR, you could pull somebody up. So anyway, just curious, thought maybe you could shed some light on it for us and maybe some of the other fans who don't know. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, David. Again, appreciate you for calling in and anyone who calls in at 412-223-6644. And David, this is a very much yes or no question. The answer is yes, they can open up the 53-man roster. No, he doesn't count against 53-man roster. But yeah, when Cameron Sutton's suspended on those 8 games, he is not on the Steelers 53-man roster, so they can add somebody to the roster to replace him. That is just the NFL rules. But I do think it's interesting because that's not a question that everybody knows off the top of their head. Now, I've had to answer that question a few times, and I've had to look it up, so I was like, I'm pretty sure that is, and I just confirmed, yep, that's exactly what the rule is. Like, you look at recently suspended players, like last year, I think it was Jamison Williams for the Lions was suspended for 8 games. Guess what? They were able to have another guy on the roster, and I do think that adds more to the conversation of why I think the Steelers should go get somebody, even if it is someone cheap and someone that doesn't necessarily move the needle to some all-star level like Shannon Sullivan. But I do think that could be something that you look at where if Shannon Sullivan is playing well, okay, then you keep him around. If he's not, guess what? Then you can let him go for nothing and Cameron Sutton's back after week 8. That's why I just think that was there. But to anyone who did have that question in their head, wait a second, do we have to carry Cam Sutton on the 53-man roster for half the season? No, the Steelers do not have to do that. So do not stress about that. That is, he'll be able to kind of be around the team, but he won't be able to play on Sundays, and the NFL will not count that against the Steelers. So answering that question from David. But I want to get to what I was talking about earlier, too, about the young players on defense that can arise, and especially Keeanu Benton and Joey Porter Jr. Someone called about that recently. I want to get to their question next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Back here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here today going over your questions and talking with you about different things here. But like I said, I wanted to get to this question. This one comes from Ted, all the way down in Tallahassee, Florida. Ted, take it away.
Hey, Chris, big fan of the show. This is Ted from Tallahassee. One thing I was wondering your thoughts on, if Benton and JPJ take a jump up and Cam Hayward gets back to, say, 7 or more sacks, and the rest of the defense just stays relatively healthy, I think we have a truly special defense on our team. Or at least it's not crazy to say that that is possible. And you look at that in the bigger picture and this kind of thought that the Steelers are really the worst team in the AFC North, and frankly, there's not a prayer of them actually getting to the championship. Is that just more or less admitting that an amazing defense, a top 3 defense, isn't even worth the thought of being a contender in the AFC North even? Like I said, I don't think it's crazy to think that they could be special. Thanks.
Thank you for your question, Ted. As always, call in 412-223-6644 to get your question on the air, just like Ted just did. So, Ted, let's get into a few things here. One, I don't think it's crazy to think the Steelers could be special this year. I do think that they have a lot of odds against them, and that's why, like we talked about it recently with the Vegas odds on this show, and how the Vegas odds have them not even getting a winning record this season and actually finishing with a losing record. But guess what? They've beaten Vegas odd for 4 years in a row, and they haven't had a losing record since 2003, which was the first year that Mark Caboli, who was on the show yesterday, actually started covering the Steelers. So there you go. I was in 8th grade. But back to the whole to your question about Porter and Benton and his defense. I think that it revolves around both these young guys taking significant steps up and being these major contributors. And yes, Cam Hayward also needs to get back. And I think that's where the thing is that oftentimes when people are projecting for teams to be really good to great, especially having great defenses, they want to see it already there. They want to see that like the production's been there for these guys and that they've had it. And that's where I think that there are still several question marks about this defense. Now, they are question marks that I think lean in a positive light for the Steelers because of how some of these players have looked. But I do think that they are legitimate question marks. And let's go over some of those question marks. Will Keeanu Benton and Joey Porter Jr. take a step up? I think that they both can. How big of a step up? I don't know. I want to see their potential. But we talked with Carl Dunbar, the Steelers defensive line coach, and we showed a clip on his show last month where when I talked to him, I asked him about Keeanu Benton, and Keeanu Benton talked about finishing better. Carl Dunbar probably said he had 7 sacks, 7 situations where he should have finished it with a sack, and he didn't. And if he had those, it's a whole different ballgame. And I think that's where, if Benton can get to finishing sacks more consistently, let's say he turns 5 of those into sacks. And I think he already had 1 sack in the season. If he's a 6-sack defensive tackle as a second-year player, he's making great progress. So, that's where I think there could be hope there. Now, and again, with Joey Porter Jr., we've talked about his production and what he did last year. If he can turn down the penalties but keep up the coverage numbers, I think that he's taking a positive step in the right way forward. And I think that he's a guy who's proven to be a studious player who studies his opponent, studies himself, and works to better himself a lot. Has a great work ethic. It's one of the reasons the Steelers loved to get him in the first place. And again, last year, I think he had the lowest completion percentage allowed of any cornerback who was targeted at least 50 times in the NFL. That's nothing to sneeze at, as that's something that shows that he had a good rookie season and that he can build on that. But the question is, can both of them build on that? And can Hayward come back healthy and play really well? And can Dante Jackson / Shannon was not there, / whoever's going to be the slot cornerback, can they fit into this defense well? And can all these other things? That's the thing, is that there are so many we don't know yet questions about this defense. Things we do know: TJ Watt's going to be a bad man. Alex Highsmith's going to be a bad man. Minka Fitzpatrick's going to be a bad man if he's in the right position. And that's another thing that we have to see actually happen with the Steelers. Now, again, we see a lot of suggestions that could be happening this year. Patrick Queen's at linebacker, which is going to give them another cover linebacker option, and that could be the most solidified that position has been since Ryan Shazier and Vince Williams were on the team together. And that was 8 years ago, maybe more than that. So, I think back to that, and I think that's, there's reasons for that. Deshaun Elliott maybe being the best strong safety to ever pair with Minka Fitzpatrick. That is where I think a lot of the questions, hey, we think Minka Fitzpatrick can get to there, but can he get back to where he was even just 2 years ago when he had 6 interceptions and he led the NFL in that? Can Joey Porter step out on that? Can the supporting cornerbacks also help out there? Can Cam Hayward get back? Again, that's where I think a lot of the questions are. But again, to your point, Ted, the potential is there. Now, the Steelers being a top 3 defense, that's not just something that you just they can just be a top 3 defense. They don't have to work their butts off to do that, because there are some really good defenses in the NFL. But last year, even with all the problems they had, even with all the injuries they had at safety and at linebacker and all the problems that went down, they still finished as the 6th best scoring defense in the NFL. Granted, a lot of that was because they played really good situational football, and because they did give up the 21st most yards in the NFL, but they were able to hold it down at the points that mattered most. But this is a team who just 4 or 5 years ago, they were in the top 5. They were the number 3 defense in the NFL in 2020, the number 5 defense in the NFL in 2019. I think they can get back to being at that level with the current roster that they have. But it does require young guys to step up. It does require some of these younger players to figure out things a little bit quicker than other younger players have. But again, if you really think we've heard a lot of praise for Omar Khan and how he's drafted these first two drafts that he's had, and he's ran for the Steelers. If you think that Omar Khan done a great job with that, and every sense that we get of guys like Porter, guys like Benton, they're locker room dudes. They're positive environment guys. They're guys that buy in and want to be better, and you don't have to motivate. They're self-motivators. I think there's every reason to expect those guys to take jumps up this year. And I'm not saying Pro Bowl jumps ups. I'm not saying all pro jumps ups. I'm saying that they could be guys who are on the cusp of that and make people that ever recognize, like, oh, there's some of the young defensive linemen and cornerbacks in the NFL right now. I mean, maybe they're not, in the consideration of like the top cornerbacks, like Patrick Surtain or anything like that, or Chris Jones, for Keeanu Benton, but maybe they're in that cusp of they're among one of the best rising players at their position. And if they are, that could be really good. And again, we talked about this recently with Nick Farabaugh on Wednesday about how if you did a redraft this year of the 2023 draft class, both Porter and Benton would be drafted considerably higher. In fact, one article in CBS had Benton as the 10th overall pick there, not just not a mid-second round pick, but a high first round pick. And Joey Porter Jr. was also higher in that draft. So I look at the potential there. I do think there's a lot to go behind with what the potential of those two guys have and how they can mesh with a defense that knows who it is. And that's another part that I think does play in this unit's favor, is that while the offense is going to be figuring out who they are, and I think they will have a much better sense of who they need to be and who they want to be going into the season than they've had since 2017, 2018, that far back. But this defense knows who they are. It's the same defensive coordinator. It's a lot of the same stars. They have captains. They have leadership. It is easier to file in and fill in with the defense than it is on the offense right now. And I think that will help guys like Benton and Porter play to their strengths, focus on their games without having to worry about resetting a culture like the offense has to do, and not having to worry about trying to be the alpha on a unit. That's something that needs to be figured out on offense. That's something that doesn't need to be figured out on defense. TJ Watt, alpha. Minkah Fitzpatrick, alpha. Cam Hayward, more like a senior alpha, but still an alpha. And, as long as he comes back healthy and he's ready to go. And that allows for guys like Porter and Benton to take their time to figure themselves out, but also focus on their craft so that when it is time for them to be leaders, they're ready to be leaders. That's what happened with TJ Watt in 2017 in the early years. I think Minkah Fitzpatrick came in right away and he was that guy. That's another reason why I thought Minkah Fitzpatrick was one of the best options out of the draft when he was coming out and he was picked by the Dolphins so early in his draft class. But I think there's a lot of potential for that in this defense and on this team. And that is why I do think there is the potential for this team to surprise people and be better than what they're expected to be. I don't think they're going to have a losing record. I think they're going to have double-digit wins, and I think they could definitely be a playoff team that is a lot more dangerous than what they've had in their past several playoff teams. We'll get to more on that next week as we get here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks, everyone, for calling in on the show. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. Find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Hope you have a great weekend, everyone. We're back Monday with more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.